The silence within the hallowed, neoclassical halls of the Mariner S. Eccles Federal Reserve Board building felt less like the customary pre-meeting calm and more like the profound, deafening quiet just before an artillery shell hits. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, the man whose cautious, meticulous, and agonizingly data-driven stewardship of the world's most powerful central bank has defined the global financial landscape for the better part of a decade, looked up from his notepad. The light, normally filtering gently through the tall windows facing Constitution Avenue, now seemed harsh, reflecting the chaos outside as it glinted off the polished mahogany of the boardroom table, a surface usually reserved for the deliberative, measured weight of monetary policy decisions. Seated opposite Powell was the tight, intensely focused circle of advisors, governors, and senior staff. Their collective presence formed a nucleus of American financial authority, but today they appeared shattered. Each face, from Vice Chair Lael Brainerd's tightly drawn composure to the visible tremor in the hands of the Director of Research, was a mirror reflecting a terrifying blend of shock, anxiety, and utterly raw disbelief. The televised broadcast, muted on the massive, high-definition screen at the room's end, was the source of this pervasive dread. It continued to show the president, bathed in the sharp morning sun, at a hastily called press conference in the White House Rose Garden, the formidable seal of the President of the United States gleaming almost mockingly behind him. The air in the room was thick, not just with unspoken tension, but with the undeniable, metallic scent of impending financial collapse. The S&P 500 futures ticker scrolling relentlessly beneath the image was not just red. It was a crimson streak of accelerating, uncontrolled descent, signaling a hemorrhage of capital unprecedented in recent memory. He can't actually be serious, whispered Vice Chair Brainerd, her voice barely audible, choked off by disbelief and the sheer audacity of the situation, sounding less like a senior official commenting on policy and more like a desperate plea for a return to sanity. The statement was not a policy question to be debated, but a profound, urgent appeal for a reality check that the room and the country desperately needed. Powell, who prided himself on his unflappable composure, the steady hand of global finance, leaned back in his high-backed leather chair. He instinctively pressed his hands together, his fingers intertwined so tightly that the knuckles were bloodless white against the leather. The internal mechanism that usually allowed him to compartmentalize political noise and focus purely on the dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment was malfunctioning, overloaded by the sheer political velocity of the moment. The situation was being driven not by CPI reports or employment figures, but by pure, weaponized political will. The rumors had been simmering for weeks that the White House National Economic Council Director, Kevin Hassett, was already the market's consensus frontrunner to replace Powell when his current term expired in May. That was standard political maneuvering. What the president had just announced, however, was anything but standard. It was a radical, audacious, and legally dubious acceleration of the timeline, delivered with the blunt force of a wrecking ball against the foundations of the Federal Reserve Act. The official declaration was the appointment of a new, utterly unprecedented, and constitutionally questionable position, a special, cabinet-level official titled the Special Commissioner for Monetary Policy Alignment. This individual was to report directly and solely to the Oval Office, bypassing the normal checks and balances of the Treasury, the Fed, and Congress. The establishment of this commissioner was, in Powell's legal estimation and the alarmed analysis of the Fed's general counsel, an overt and brazen attempt to gut the Fed's celebrated, sacred, and painstakingly maintained independence. The president's own words, blasted across social media in a furious, all-caps tweet storm minutes before the presser, summarized the commissioner's mandate with terrifying simplicity: get the rates down. Now, stop the Powell-era economic sabotage and the globalist cabal. The sheer audacity of the move, installing a mechanism to override or heavily influence the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, had caused the immediate financial market response, an uncontrolled crash. The markets had collectively shed trillions in market capitalization in the span of less than 45 minutes, as the very bedrock of U.S. monetary stability seemed to crumble live on camera. The core of the panic wasn't just the overt attempt at rate meddling. It was the name attached to the new, utterly unconstitutional office. A name that brought a fresh, uncontrollable jolt of disruptive, world-altering energy into the already fragile financial ecosystem, Elon Musk. The president's dramatic announcement, delivered with his characteristic flair for high-stakes shock and maximal spectacle, had explicitly named Musk the industrialist, media mogul, and master provocateur, fresh off his controversial, now-ended advisory role with the esoteric Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, as the individual tap to unleash American prosperity, debottleneck the financial system, and put the brakes on the global reset. The appointment, if legal challenges failed to immediately halt the action, granted Musk unprecedented de facto leverage over the Federal Reserve's decisions. This influence was not merely consultative, but was formalized through a new, powerful, and binding consultative authority on interest rate targets, quantitative easing, and bond market operations, an authority that the White House was claiming superseded the existing FOMC mechanisms under emergency executive decree authority. Musk himself had not yet offered a public comment, allowing his reputation and the ensuing global pandemonium to speak for him. But the implication was clear. Musk, who once casually dismissed the entire concept of free trade as less efficient than targeted nationalized production, and whose mercurial pronouncements could move entire market sectors with a single late-night tweet, was now positioned to dictate the flow of the world's reserve currency. Powell, looking at the data showing the immediate and total erosion of investor confidence, understood with chilling clarity that this was far more than a political stunt designed to boost approval ratings or punish the Federal. It was an ideological war on the central bank itself, a direct assault on the fundamental principle that monetary policy must be insulated from the electoral cycles and the transient whims of political power. The separation of fiscal and monetary powers, the cornerstone of modern Western economics, was under siege. He looked at the plummeting market data, indicators dropping into zones not seen since the peak of the 2008 crisis, and then back at the muted screen. The president was now gesturing emphatically to a waiting Musk, who stood with the slight, expectant posture of a man about to launch a new, world-changing product. Musk, the disruptive visionary who thrives on chaos and the tearing down of established structures, was now the designated architect of U.S. financial policy. The long-feared showdown between the White House and the Federal Reserve had not merely arrived, it had gone thermal. The rules, the rigid, centuries-old rules of global finance, had just been ripped apart and rewritten in real time by a tweet and an executive order. Powell inhaled slowly, trying to pull oxygen from the thick, static-charged air, bracing himself. He knew this was not a meeting, nor a mere crisis. It was the end of one era and the terrifying, uncertain start of another, and the trajectory of the entire global economy was now hanging in the balance. The task of defending the system against its own executive branch, a scenario deemed unthinkable just hours ago, had just become his burden. The battle for the soul of the American economy had begun, and the odds were firmly against the defender. Jerome Powell pushed his chair back from the mahogany table, the slight grating sound momentarily breaking the sacred stillness of the boardroom. The move was involuntary, a physical manifestation of a professional life's worth of shock. The room, which contained the most experienced monetary minds in the United States, was now an echo chamber of incredulity. The silent, flickering image of the president and Elon Musk, the unlikely duo standing together in the rose garden sunlight, represented not just a political challenge, but an existential threat to the $27 trillion U.S. Treasury market and the global financial architecture built since Bretton Woods. Vice Chair Brainerd, recovering quickly from her initial whisper, adopted the sharp, analytical tone of a lawyer preparing for the Supreme Court. "Mr. Chair," she began, her voice regaining its firmness, "we must convene the ad hoc legal committee immediately. General Counsel is on a secure line now. The appointment of a special commissioner with a mandate to align monetary policy is clearly an unconstitutional encroachment on the Federal Reserve Act's separation of powers doctrine, specifically concerning the FOMC's autonomy. We need a restraining order filed in the D.C. District Court, not in days, but in hours." Powell slowly nodded, his eyes locked on the S&P futures ticker, a constant, vivid reminder of the world's rapidly deteriorating confidence. "Agreed, Leo. The legal fight is necessary, but it's a fight on the enemy's chosen ground. The markets are collapsing right now because they don't trust that the courts can move fast enough, or that the eventual ruling won't be overturned by a politically motivated Supreme Court. We are in a crisis of credibility, not merely a legal dispute." The core issue, he articulated, tapping a finger lightly on the table, was not the existence of the position, but the name attached to it. Elon Musk, the man who once suggested the entire government could be run on a simplified, crypto-based distributed ledger system, was now positioned as the president's shadow chair. Musk's very presence, his reputation for disruptive, no-holds-barred, and often capricious decision-making, had poured gasoline on the market's fear. The immediate assumption of every major trading floor was that rates would be arbitrarily slashed to zero, or even into the negative, to juice the economy for the next election cycle, regardless of inflationary pressure or systemic risk. The president has given Musk a mandate for maximum efficiency in finance. Musk's interpretation of that, based on his past work on DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, is that the entire existing framework, the beige book, the economic forecasts, the models, are overstaffed and inefficient. He will treat the interest rate as a single variable he can adjust, ignoring the complex, global transmission mechanism that governs market health, Powell explained to the assembled governors. He will try to turn monetary policy into an algorithmic process, bypassing the human judgment and institutional caution that is the only real protection against boom-bust cycles. Governor Waller, a respected economist, pointed to a chart projected onto the wall. The TED spread, a key indicator of credit risk, was spiking violently. "Chair, the interbank lending market is seizing up. Commercial banks are pricing in a systemic risk event. They don't know who is in charge of the money supply. They fear the government is about to effectively nationalize the rate-setting mechanism. Our only countermove must be to assert our control, right now, publicly and unequivocally. We cannot be seen to be paralyzed," Brainerd agreed. "We need an emergency statement from the Federal Reserve that clearly outlines our next, decisive action. We cannot wait for the next scheduled FOMC meeting." Powell drew a deep breath. This was the moment of decision. The traditional Fed response would be to issue a stern, legalistic statement reaffirming their independence, a move that would be DOA, dead on arrival, against the president's populism and Musk's media dominance. He had to pivot, to act with a speed and boldness that contradicted his entire professional reputation, yet was the only way to shock the markets back into stability. "We will hold an unscheduled press conference at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time," Powell declared, his voice cutting through the tension. "And we will not issue a dry legal rebuttal. We will reassert our control through policy action." He looked at his chief of staff. "Get the 12 Federal Reserve Bank presidents on a video bridge. I want a preliminary vote on a new emergency action before noon." We are going to counter the president's demand for a rate cut with a preemptive, stabilizing move that proves the independence of the Federal Reserve is not merely a legal concept, but an active, indispensable force. The plan Powell was formulating was a monumental gamble, to use the threat of a crisis, ironically created by the White House, to justify a rapid, unified, and unprecedented action by the FOMC, a shock-and-awe defense of the institution itself. He had to give the markets a signal so strong, so unambiguous, that it drowned out the noise from the Rose Garden. The fate of the U.S. dollar's status as the global reserve currency and the integrity of the world's most critical financial system now rested on his ability to move faster than the political chaos that sought to dismantle him. "This is our last stand, people," Powell finished, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the board. "We will make it clear. Elon Musk sets the price of rockets, but the Federal Reserve sets the price of money." The room stirred, the shock beginning to give way to a grim, professional resolve. The clock was ticking. They had less than 3 hours to save the financial world. The boardroom had instantly transformed into a command center. 12 screens, one for each Federal Reserve Bank president, flickered to life across the far wall, displaying the stressed, anxious faces of the individuals responsible for the regional health of the U.S. economy. This was a rare, unscheduled Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, convocation, a digital war council called by Chairman Powell to defend the very institution they served. The mood was one of grim, professional urgency, the kind reserved for systemic shock events, a pandemic, a financial collapse, not an internal political assault. Powell stood at the head of the long table, the live, tumbling market data his backdrop. "Good morning, everyone," he stated, his voice calm, but carrying a steely edge that conveyed the gravity of the crisis. "You have all seen the news. We are not here to debate the legality of the so-called special commissioner. That is the General Counsel's fight, and they are moving for an emergency injunction against the executive order. We are here to debate the only thing that matters right now: policy." He paused, letting the statement sink in. The markets are reading this political interference as a certainty of a forced, politically motivated rate cut, an inflationary move designed purely for short-term political gain. This expectation is why the TED spread is spiking and the long end of the Treasury curve is pricing in a massive risk premium for U.S. debt. If we wait for the courts, the markets will have burned to the ground. Our duty is to the mandate, price stability and maximum employment. We must act now to aggressively restore credibility. Collision. The proposed counteraction. Powell laid out his plan. It was audacious, bordering on revolutionary for the typically cautious Federal Reserve. The consensus in the room had always been to hold steady against political noise. Today, holding steady was a form of surrender. The executive branch has demanded we cut rates. We will not. Instead, I am proposing an emergency 50 basis point increase to the federal funds rate, effective immediately. This is not driven by new economic data. Our inflation trajectory remains on target. It is driven by the immediate, catastrophic breakdown of inflation expectations due to the political interference. The proposal detonated a fresh wave of shock through the video screens. A 50 BP hike, in response to a White House demand for a cut, was a declaration of war. Lori Logan, Dallas Fed, Mr. Chair, a hike of that magnitude, without a corresponding surge in incoming CPI or employment data, risks a severe over-tightening into a weak patch. It risks giving the president the recession he's warning about, thereby lending legitimacy to his interference. John Williams, New York Fed, I agree with the necessity of a strong signal, but 50 points? That is a move reserved for when we are actively behind the curve. We need to be careful not to create a policy-induced crisis while fighting a political-induced crisis. What about an emergency liquidity injection through the Standing Repo Facility, SRF, instead? that addresses the interbank seizing without shocking the real economy. Powell, liquidity is an underlying symptom. The disease is the loss of institutional credibility. The SRF is a band-aid. We need to reset the entire global perception of the US dollar and the Fed's autonomy. By immediately raising rates, we send an unmistakable signal. The price of money is set by the FOMC based on our mandate and not by the Oval Office. The hike is the shock and awe defense of our independence. Balance scale the hawks and the doves. The subsequent internal debate was fierce, compressed into a matter of minutes. The members of the Board of Governors, the President's own appointees, though protected by for cause removal provisions, were split. The doves, e.g., Brainerd, Goolsbee argued for the necessity of the signal, but favored a smaller, 25 BP hike combined with a clear, written threat to use quantitative tightening, QT, if political pressure continued. They worried about the collateral damage to the housing market. The hawks, e.g., Waller, Bullard advocated for the full 50 BP hike, arguing that anything less would be perceived by the markets as weakness, a mere token resistance to the president's power. They cited the 1970s and the political pressures placed on Chairman Arthur Burns by the Nixon administration, which led directly to runaway inflation that Paul Volcker later had to crush with extreme, painful measures. We must avoid the 70s rerun at all costs, argued Waller. Powell listened intently, constantly referencing the real-time data flashing on his screen, the surging VIX volatility index, and the rapid depreciation of the dollar against a basket of currencies. The global financial system was already responding to the perception of political interference as if it were a reality. Perception was the reality they had to fight. The 50 basis point move, Powell concluded, bringing the debate to an abrupt end, is not an economic forecast. It is an institutional policy statement. It is the most powerful signal we have to re-anchor inflation expectations immediately and prove that we retain control of our primary tool. We cannot compromise on the strength of that signal. He called for the vote. The silence returned, this time heavy with the weight of consequence. The fate of the U.S. economy for the next decade, and perhaps the global financial order, hung on the result of a simple digital tally. They had decided the action. Now, they had to prove they had the unity and the institutional courage to execute it against the most powerful person in the country. The tension in the Eccles building boardroom, already palpable, now seemed to actively vibrate. The roll call vote for the emergency 50 basis point rate hike, a direct, institutional defiance of the White House and its new commissioner, Elon Musk, was complete. Every FOMC member, whether physically present or dialing in from their respective Federal Reserve banks across the country, had cast their ballot on a secure digital system, watched by the chairman and his executive team. Powell stared at the final tally projected onto the screen, 9-3. It was a majority, enough to enact the policy, but the 3 dissenting votes, the most significant internal dissent on a major policy action in over a decade, were a stark reminder of the fragile unity underlying this unprecedented defense. The dissenters were primarily the regional bank presidents most focused on the health of the commercial real estate and manufacturing sectors, worried that such an aggressive tightening, divorced from economic fundamentals, would guarantee a sharp, avoidable recession. The dissent will be noted, Powell announced, his voice steady, acknowledging the political vulnerability the divided vote created. But the action is affirmed. We have an hour and 15 minutes until the press conference. Vice Chair Brainerd, who had ultimately voted for the hike, leaned in. Chair, we have to frame this perfectly. The president will frame it as the Powell cabal sabotaging the economy. We need to be surgical. The core message must be, this is not an economic action. It is a fiduciary action to protect the U.S. dollar and the rule of law. Suddenly, the secured communications director interrupted, his face pale. Mr. Chair, Incoming. We have a comment from Elon Musk. He just posted a long-form public letter on X, directed to the FOMC. The room collectively froze as the letter was rapidly pulled up on the main screen. Musk's prose was sharp, dismissive, and utterly incendiary. It didn't address the legality, it addressed the efficiency. He framed the Fed's existence as a remnant of a bygone era of slow, bureaucratic finance, and directly accused the governors of preparing to launch an act of financial sabotage against the American people by artificially raising the cost of capital. Musk's key line, which immediately started trending globally, was a perfect encapsulation of his disruptive philosophy. The only thing the Powell Fed is defending is their own obsolescence. Monetary policy must be managed with the speed and precision of a hyperloop, not the inertia of a steam train. This attempted hike is a self-inflicted wound, a clear move by the old guard to crush innovation. The attack was brilliant. It shifted the narrative instantly from a legal debate about independence to a populist battle between the elite, slow-moving establishment, and the futuristic, people-focused disruptor. Powell knew he couldn't win the public relations battle with legal jargon. He glanced at the clock, 12 p.m. He had 1 hour to craft a response that was both legally sound and politically explosive enough to re-anchor the world's faith in the American financial system. The 50 BP hike was merely the ammunition. The press conference was the shot that had to land. The Federal Reserve press briefing room, usually a quiet hub of economic discourse, was a blinding flash of cameras and microphone booms. Chairman Jerome Powell walked to the podium precisely at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, flanked by Vice Chair Brainerd. The world was watching. He did not mince words, nor did he offer a dry economic forecast. He began with a declaration that instantly resonated across global markets, a direct rejection of the Musk/White House narrative. The Federal Reserve System is today taking decisive action to protect the long-term stability of the American economy. Our decision is driven by one fact: the confidence in the independence of the institution that sets the price of the world's reserve currency is under direct political assault. Powell then announced the unanimous, despite the actual 9-3 vote, decision of the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, effective immediately. The target range for the federal funds rate will be raised by 50 basis points. He pivoted instantly to address the political elephant in the room. Let me be explicit. This is not an action based on our routine economic models. This is a move to aggressively defend the price stability mandate from an external, non-economic threat. When the markets believe that monetary policy is being set by political will, they demand a higher risk premium for holding U.S. debt and the U.S. dollar. This hike is the necessary, prophylactic institutional response to re-anchor long-term inflation expectations and protect the dollar's integrity. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.